All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about Webpack. This was inspired by Review Week when I wanted to start my own project, and I realized I knew nothing about Webpack. So it's really a presentation for me, and I thought I'd share kind of what I learned with you guys. My goal today is to answer 3 questions. What is Webpack? How does it work? And how do I use it? So Webpack is basically, it takes modules with dependencies and generates static assets representing those modules. So it's a lot of words. I think as I explain how it's working under the hood, it'll kind of clarify this. But first, I kind of want to talk about why Webpack. I heard online, or read online somewhere that it has like 1 million downloads a week, and it's gaining more and more in popularity all the time. So kind of what's making it so popular? At the end of the day, Webpack allows web developers to write modular code for the front end. Because otherwise, we have a bunch of issues such as we have to load multiple script tags, we have to load multiple files, we have to worry about the order of it, we have issues with polluting the global variable, the global scope. So Webpack, it'll take all of our dependencies, it'll generate one file and send that and serve that up to the browser. Another cool thing is we can write our code in ES6. We can write it in CoffeeScript. And Webpack will serve it up in plain JavaScript so the browser can understand it. All right, so how does it work? Just 4 simple steps. It finds dependencies, it applies loaders, it implements the module system, and it creates the final file. That's it. When I first heard that, I was like, sure thing. So what I have is kind of an example where I want to kind of go through it a little bit and help you guys, kind of visualize it as an example. So, one second. All right. So the first thing it does is it's going to find dependencies. So this is some example code. Just kind of pretend that these are separate files in your directory, and they all kind of export or require each other. So we have an index, which is going to log the area of a circle. Then we have a function that's multiplying pi times the squared radius. And then we have a function that squares the radius. So what it's going to do is we give Webpack an entry point. And that's defined in our config, and that's going to be our index.js. That is, we're going to put that in an array. And we always know that our entry point is going to be at the 0th index of our array. Then Webpack is going to go through our code and find everywhere we require or import. So we see in line 2, we are requiring an area of a circle. So it's going to try and resolve that path. Once it finds that file, it's going to then add it onto the array. So the cool thing about the array is we know where every module is. We can access it with no problem. And then we're going to apply our loaders. Loaders are basically just, it processes your file and then transforms them from, like, for example, one language to another. So CoffeeScript to JavaScript. A really common loader that we've used in class is the Babel loader. So it allows us to use ES6, and it turns it into ES5 for the browser. Some are internal, and some you can kind of install and set up in your config. Next, we're going to implement the module system. So, all right. So what that means is for every file, we're going to wrap it in a function. So you see, like, now they're all in functions, and they all take 2 arguments, module and Webpack require. We're going to kind of go deeper into what Webpack requires in a second. And then we're going to see that everywhere that we previously required a path, we're going to now replace with Webpack require with the index of where that file is located in that array. Does that make sense? And then lastly, we're going to create our final asset. And that is here. This is basically kind of like the meat and potatoes of what Webpack is doing. It's a function. It takes in an array of modules. And then we're going to immediately invoke this function with that module array that we defined previously, right? So inside of this function, we actually are finally getting to define what Webpack require is. It takes in an index, and then we're defining a module variable. That module is an object with a key export, which is set to an empty object. This should look very familiar to all of us. It's kind of almost creating like a dummy module exports that that will kind of attach to whatever we defined in our code. Then we're defining file, which is basically just that element in the array. And because we wrapped it in a function, we're now going to invoke it. We're going to pass in that module that we defined on line 5 and pass it the Webpack require function. And what's cool is when we invoke this file, we're going to get all of those side effects that we originally intended in that module. So if we want to render something or add something to the DOM or something like that, that's going to happen. And then we're going to return our module.exports. So to kind of fire everything off, we're going to call Webpack require on 0, which as we know is our index, index.js, which is our entry point. So I'm going to go back here and kind of walk through the code I showed you before and what's going on with Webpack. So this should look kind of familiar. So on line 10, we're calling Webpack require on our index.js. So here we see, all right, we're calling it invoked. Area of a circle is now set to Webpack require of 1. That's going to set off a recursive call to Webpack. Then that's going to implement and it's going to call area of a circle, and that's going to be invoked. We see another Webpack require. Again, we're kind of adding it onto the call stack until eventually we hit squared radius. There's no Webpack require, so what's going to do is going to return module.exports, which is this function of squaring the radius. Now that means area of a circle can now have access to that function. That can resolve. We're going to export, again, this module.exports, so that way our index.js can have access to it right here. And then we're just going to console log the area of a circle. And that is really kind of how Webpack is able to look at our dependencies and kind of create this static file that we're then going to serve up to the browser. The last minute or so, I kind of want to talk about the config file, which was a huge mystery to me for a really long time. Let me just find my mouse. All right, so learning what Webpack is doing, what it needs, and how it's operating really helped kind of demystify this for me. So you always need to make sure it's webpack.config.js. It's just a regular JavaScript file, and we're exporting this huge object. And at the end of the day, what it really needs is just an entry point and an output. So entry is that starting file that will set off all these dependencies and these recursive calls and things like that. And then output is typically our bundle.js file. We're pretty familiar with that. And then that one file can be added to our HTML and our script tag. And then what's all this stuff, right? So I think a lot of the reputation that Webpack gets of being very confusing and very opaque comes from the fact that your config file can be very tailored to whatever your project is, that you can customize it. So you can Google how do I set up my config file, and you'll probably find as many different ways as there are, really. So for module, it's telling us how do we treat our modules? What are we going to do to them? So we see here we are going to, I think the big thing is our loaders. We're going to apply the Babel loader so we can use our ES6. And again, these are just additional ways to define it, customize it, and that's kind of where you just dig into the docs, really. And then you can do something else like plugins. This just came from our Bones code, and it's like a live reload plugin. It's just additional ways to configure, tailor, and customize your your function or your project. So that kind of wraps up my goal. I hope you guys have a better sense of what Webpack is doing under the hood, and makes it a little bit less scary, and kind of gives you some bearings for when you start exploring, creating your own config file and things like that. All right, thank y'all.